My name is Matt Smith, and I'm Vice President of Internet Television at Invivio. And we help enterprises, networks, broadcasters, multiple system operators prepare content for any screen, anywhere, anytime. And today I'm joined by a great group of industry experts here who are going to help us understand their video workflow, products, and architecture. So in this session, we're going to look at the complexities in preparing media elements and looking at mobility as it relates to that strategy for multi-screen environments. And similar to the session that I moderated yesterday, I want to remind you that it's just like 18 months ago, it seems like we were talking about 3-screen environments. Now, I think it's fair to say that those have become end screens, right? It's no longer just about 3 specific pieces of glass. We've come a long way in a long time. And if you're up to date on the trends and the consumption patterns, mobile platforms and consumption are going to just skyrocket in the next few months and not years ahead. But as you're probably familiar with, creating content for all these screens is no trivial task. It can be fairly complex. It reminds me of a question that I was asked a couple of years ago at Yahoo by an engineer who asked me, Matt, what's the universal codec? After laughing, I told him that there wasn't one. So let's dive in. Let's meet these folks on the panel here and talk about some of these challenges that they face every day. So joining me for what seems like about the 10th time on the panel, one of my better panelists, not setting the bar too high there, Joe, is Joe Anzarillo. He's Senior Vice President for Digital Media Operations at MajorLeagueBaseball.com. Joe, introduce yourself, tell the audience a little bit about you and your team.
Sure. So I oversee both the content technology and the operations side of the intersection between mobile and multimedia. And I think it's sort of, kind of totally appropriate for this panel that I started running multimedia and then very quickly wound up taking over the mobile development as well, because the intersection between those two is sort of inseparable at this point in time. Consumption has become more personal, more portable, and in the future, I don't think that you're going to be able to mention mobile without mentioning multimedia, which was certainly not the case, just a few years ago, as you were saying. So it's been an interesting challenge, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks for being here. Next, we have Gerald Abramson, who is Vice President of Digital Media Operations at NBC Universal and E-Television. Welcome.
Thank you. So I run all digital operations for E-Entertainment. We used to handle Style and also G4 to a certain extent, but now with Comcast buying NBC, we're part of NBC Universal, and we're now very brand focused, and so my focus is on the E brand. And when I first started, focused on more of the non-traditional digital plays, VOD, and more recently moved into the mobile, and then now it's full digital platform. So everything, multiple screens, from VOD, electronic sell-through, mobile platforms. We started out in the space in terms of delivering content to aggregators like Verizon and Sprint on the mobile platforms. And now we become very much more direct to consumer. We have our own apps, our mobile sites are full-fledged, and we now have to worry about the iPad and digital on the iPad. So very complex, very difficult to maneuver with all the different platforms. 15,000 plus different handsets. Can you really support that? Very difficult to. I think Apple and Google have made our lives a little bit simpler, but there's more complexity in the Google space than anywhere else. But that complexity, hopefully we can help you guys through this.
Thank you. Welcome as well, Michael Dunn, the CTO of Hurst Interactive Media.
Hi. So my job is a corporate job. I oversee and help our divisions. We have newspaper, TV stations, magazines. We own percentages of some cable channels. We have B2B businesses, and then we have pure play web businesses. And I look across the technology footprint across all of them and try to get them to do things that we can do better as Hurst, the enterprise, versus specifically for a local DMA TV station or a local newspaper. I tend to spend a lot of time on emerging technologies, semantic web, structuring of content, where the web's going to be going versus where it is today. Mobile is a part of it. We were fairly early for a big media company to get involved in putting our brands onto iPhone, iPad, and lately Android, and look forward to where it's going.
Thank you. So we'll start where Gerald touched on in his introduction, in that there's a proliferation of devices out there. There's a lot of screens, there's a lot of glass that we have to render content on. And it seems to me that it's disruptive, or at least it has been. We may have gotten over the hurdles. But Joe, can you talk about how you've had to think in the last 12 to 18 months as all these different screens of different sizes have become part of the audience that you deliver to?
Well, I think, fragmentation is definitely an issue. There's no question about that. And the fragmentation is not just the number of devices, it's also the operating system revisions. And I think that one, to me, is actually the one that's a little bit more troubling, because new devices are always going to come out and people are going to innovate. But to some extent, let's say a certain handset manufacturer comes out with a 3D display. They're also going to make that display backwardly compatible to 2D. And so whether or not we would want to push the envelope and do some 3D with it, we sort of have that option, but it's probably going to work okay as a 2D display too, because they obviously has to be. The biggest problem that I see is when you look at something like Android, it's not just the fact that it's fragmented, it's the fact that most of the handsets go to the grave with the software revision they got at the cradle. And that's by far the most prolific problem. Whereas if you look at iOS, I mean, their adoption and penetration of new operating system builds is unbelievable. They get to 70%, depending on who you believe in a month, And so for us, the problem is that we see handsets that are even entering the marketplace today that are 3 revisions behind. And so that sort of juggling game between the manufacturer, the carrier, and Google as the software provider, I think, is probably the most troubling and makes it hardest to create compelling content. And I don't necessarily think, some people would say, when you look at the stats that are out there as far as sell-through and monetization, that Android is clearly way behind iOS and clearly not represented by their percentage of market share. A lot of people would say, well, maybe Android folks are just cheap or they don't really do it. But I really just think it's actually more so that there's not as many compelling experiences across a wide range of Android devices to the point where people are even conditioned that this is going to be an experience worth paying for. It's really dodgy, it's hit or miss. The Android marketplace is a tough place to navigate. And so I think that for our standpoint, the problem is trying to figure out where you're going to go, and it's such a fluid environment. If you would have bet really hard on HP, for example, that probably would not have been a great bet. And so for us, it's continuing to extend in platforms that we see traction on. We have the benefit of the fact that we have a website that's pretty, wireless web website, whatever you want to call it, depending on your nomenclature, that's very, very active. And so we can sort of see the devices that are out there that are coming to MLB.com and use that as a gauge to try to figure out what platforms we should be paying attention to. That doesn't necessarily mean that those platforms are capable, but it does definitely give us an indication of what our fans are doing and our ability to potentially monetize them with an app or monetize them with a subscription service.
Okay. Gerald, back over to you. You talked about it in your intro. How complex has these, I think you said 12 or 15,000 devices in the field, how do you program for them? How do you deliver to them? How do you think about your audience and their mobile usage?
Yeah, I think looking back, we were hoping that the aggregators, the Verizon and the Sprints of the world would basically manage that process. But as we become very now direct to consumer, we've got to look at that. I think we've got a wide footprint on mobile web. So to Joe's point, we look at who's coming to our sites, who's that relevant individual or that portion of the market that we can really provide our content to. And we have a difficult time making those technology bets of who's going to be next. So we're kind of in the second mover state of figuring out what are the top handsets, what are those top OSs that we can support, and we don't want to be that long shot, web OS kind of, let's do it just for the sake of doing it. So we try to stay in that top tier 80-20 rule, trying to at least hit the 80%. And that right now is iOS, Android, and BlackBerry. The lower end handsets we try to steer away from. The one thing that we've also seen is that Android is moving down downstream as well in terms of, yeah, trying to provide a $50 phone with, I think 1.6 is the lowest end. So that's a fear of us that fragmentation will continue to grow, and they're not going to, it's not easy to upgrade. So we try to have a baseline and stick to that baseline. Does the consumer lose out to a certain extent? A little bit, yes. But there's the ROI to go for that lower end handset is not there for us. And also from an ad sales perspective, we don't have any premium apps. Everything is ad-based. All the advertisers are asking for iOS. And we're like, well, we have a huge inventory of Android. Okay, we'll take it. But for the most part, it's iOS, and Apple's done a great job of just marketing themselves and literally a clear-cut leader in terms of the mobile space.
Michael, down to you. What about Hurst? So what are your key device targets, and is your approach any different than these other two gentlemen in terms of the company having an interest in the publishing space as well?
Sure. So we're mostly a domestic company, although we just bought some international magazines. So that will change our focus a little bit. Once you get outside of domestic US, there's a whole different landscape when it comes to mobile. But for mobile video, about 90% of our traffic comes from iPhone and iPad, and only 10% from Android. So our focus is, we still want to provide video for Android, but we started with iPhone, iPad, and put a lot of focus into it. And so that's been our focus, both in just mobile video and then in the app side as well. I think we use a SaaS provider. We don't we use an online video platform called Brightcove, and we work very closely with them to make sure that they're the ones staying at the cutting edge of what can be done both for online video and for mobile video, and most recently for an app offering that they have. On our side, we just want to focus on creating the content. And we do quite a bit of video around news, obviously, with TV stations and newspapers, but then we have a ton of niche-based content that's associated with magazines. And so we want to make sure that content is out there and available for a large percentage of devices, the largest percentage of devices that we can.
All right, thank you. So we've established the dominant mobility platforms. We've talked about the multitude of devices out there, but it sounds like we're still creating more renditions than ever. Joe, is there any magic silver bullet? Is there a trick? Is common encoding solving some of these problems? And what can we learn from all these renditions we have to create? How can we do it better?
Well, I think that the one thing, thankfully, at this point that's sort of gravitated is that at least everybody from the codec standpoint is really focused on H.264. And so, maybe 18 months ago, some people were talking about WebM. I haven't heard anything about it at this point. It really sort of fallen by the wayside. So it's really H.264, and that at least gives you the ability to do it in code. The transport side is a whole different story, and so there's a bunch of different ways that you have to kind of finagle that. But one of the things that we sort of talk about is we talk about it from a stack standpoint. So it's not so much like a magic in code, but we've come up with a stack that evolves over time that's pretty good in sort of a product that goes from mobile to online to tablet to everything like that. It's 12 different bit rates at different resolutions. And we've been able to hit a pretty large range of devices. I mean, we're not just on mobile devices, which is obviously the focus, mobile and tablet, which is the focus here, but also on things like PlayStation, connected, Blu-ray and television sets with LG, Sharp, Samsung, etc. And so we actually that stack is the only thing that we make, and it goes across every outlet that we have. And so at this point in time, we're on 150 consumer electronic SKUs outside of mobile, probably another supported, couple hundred mobile devices as well as web. And we are able to sort of deal with it with those 12 different renditions. The big challenge for us is it's all about live. I work for baseball. Baseball the next day, not quite as exciting as baseball live. And so that adds sort of an additional wrinkle for those folks that are in the VOD business. And so that for us is probably the biggest challenge, is how to solve the sort of real-time renditioning of it when it comes to different transport streams. Because there's real cost effective, because while the baseball game monetization curve is definitely higher, closer to live, I still have archives for the entire season. And so now between sort of what we do for baseball, our partners with CBS and Turner, for March Madness and SEC football and things like that, as well as the back-end white label solution that we provide for ESPN3, I roll the equivalent of the Netflix library every 45 days. And so I still have long-term archival issues as well. So making an additional rendition is not just the cost of encode and the cost of dealing with it, it's also the cost of long-term storage, depending on how long those archives have to hang out. And so all of those things are sort of a balancing act. And for us, what it really comes down to is trying to get some lowest common denominator things thrown out there so that we're at least on some of these platforms that we can't super serve, but we can at least serve a baseline of content to. And then if the platforms become more compelling, either add additional renditions, but try to also deprecate previous ones so that the stack itself is not really growing.
Okay, Michael, any thoughts there? Is there an easier way to do this, to create all these different renditions? I mean, adaptive bitrate has helped us to deliver much higher video quality and adapt to the network instead of vice versa. But how does Hurst approach that, whether it's a publishing business or broadcast business?
I mean, from a rendition standpoint, again, we have a partner, so we rely on them. Probably the biggest difference from what you talked about is if we have breaking news, we're going to do a very baseline rendition to put up to get it out there as quick as possible. And then we're going to do a higher end rendition to get into the queue of producing all the various renditions we want for all the end states or the end nodes. That's probably the only big difference, whether it's niche or news. And the most critical part, especially when you use a SaaS provider and you want to integrate that into your workflow, is just making sure you can get it up and going as quick as possible. But figuring out what your baseline is, I like the stack approach. I don't know that we can be that definitive because we're a multi-industry media company versus a single focus heavily online. But we'd love to get there, to have less of a stack or more of a defined stack.
So we're all in the business of creating and delivering video, and I heard some interesting stats last week at a different show that I was at that said that on the AT&T network today, or as I say, I'm sorry, I should rewind, 8% of global mobile users have smartphones, yet the AT&T 3G network in this country today is at about 80% capacity on the data side. So that opens up a discussion about LTE. And do we think that the usage patterns are going to skew even further? They're going to be even more of a hockey stick than they are today. And further, does that represent opportunity, right? So it's at the same time frightening as it is opportunistic. So Gerald, as a rights holder, someone who pushes content out for their users to consume, do we think as the mobile data pipes get bigger that the consumption is going to be similar to what it's been in the wired world?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we look at, kind of go back, is the user experience. If the user experience is poor, they're not going to like our product, whether we have control over it or not. And that's, I guess, in a traditional feature phone market, we don't have a lot of control. We're kind of at the mercy of the carrier, the handset maker, the pipeline. So the experience on a feature phone for video especially is poor. Just a lot of different factors. I'm actually looking forward to LTE and Wi-Fi networks all over the place because I think our consumption will just skyrocket. The experience will be better. So somebody who is going from a 3G connection into an LTE to a Wi-Fi will have better experience, will actually consume our content. They'll watch more clips, and we are very focused on clips, news, and information, from gossip to celebrity news. And I think we'll see usage numbers just go up significantly. I think that's the issue right now, that the bandwidth, 3G, I think we've seen this hurdle from feature phones to smartphones, but as the networks expand, I think consumption is just going to go up through the roof. And what we try to do is prepare for that. We're trying to stay ahead of the market and try to provide the best consumer experience and look forward to that.
Joe?
Yeah, I think, I definitely agree with Gerald as far as the concept that, the better the user experience, the more satisfying it is, the consumption goes up. But I think that, people often make the mistake when they talk about things like LTE or Wi-Fi of sort of treating data usage like it's water. And so for those of us who think back to our physics class, water is uncompressible, right? It takes the same volume whether you put it under pressure or not. bandwidth is a gas. And so the fact is, like, it will expand to fill the available volume. So as LTE goes up, what you're going to see is, yes, there will be more consumption, but there's also going to be more of an appetite for it. So you have things like now, for example, where you have an iPad. When that iPad goes to LTE, people are not going to be limiting the stack to, let's say, 800K or 1200K. They're going to go for the 3 meg. And so one of the things that we deal with as part of baseball is I have 30 different facilities where teams play all over the country. And we put 30, 40,000 folks in those facilities. And so what we've seen is even with really well-engineered DAS systems and Wi-Fi systems, we get a pretty good idea of what it's going to look like to try to feast on that bandwidth picture as well when you actually have a lot of bandwidth. And you still see the same problems. And so it's still now everybody's trying to get a higher quality rendition, and so now they're fighting for it, and now you get buffering and jittering and all these other sorts of things. And the protocols are struggling to sort of address those as best that they can so that you still get a baseline of it. But it's still going to be a challenge because consumption will definitely go up, I agree, but it's also going to sort of drive the engineering behind it, the traffic engineering side of it, to become better as well. Otherwise, we're just going to wind up expanding to fill the entire volume of the LTE pipe and not necessarily push better quality experiences unless we specifically engineer for it.
Okay, any other thoughts there?
No, I agree with that. If somebody's going to look at something, they want to see HD, and if they want HD, they're going to suck up as much bandwidth as possible. So you could actually go against it.
So just like with the intro, Gerald, you set my next question up beautifully. So a question that came to the website, someone asked, we're dealing with tablets and mobile screens, so the reasoning is that there are fewer pixels. Is HD necessary in a mobile world? What are the, I mean, do we really think that we're going to have the same video quality and watching experience, or viewing experience rather, on a tablet or on a mobile phone as we do in our living room on a 50-inch television?
Oh, yeah, I mean, the question first starts with what's HD? And so, there's plenty of renditions out there that people see as HD right now. I mean, I would say that for most consumers, if it's 16:9, it's HD. If it looks clear, it's HD. The technical definition of obviously what it is even subject to debate in a forum like this, where we're all video files and technologists. I think that gets even more convoluted. I mean, certainly a tablet has the expectation and approaches the resolution of an HD standard. Like, it may not be 1080p, but it's certainly 720. And so I definitely think that people have the expectation that they're going to see HD on that. And when they sideload content, let's say via iTunes or something like that, or progressively download content that's sort of cache and forward type methodology as opposed to live, they certainly have the expectation it's going to look very, very good. And so live content for us it's a struggle because some people don't necessarily get the fact that the reason the movie looks great is because it downloaded over the course of 5 hours, not as you were consuming it. I also think that other technologies that are coming down the road, when you talk about something like AirPlay, it's no longer the box that's around the device. So if I have my iPhone 4 and I'm sitting in my living room and I sling it to my Apple TV, well, I may not have the expectation that it looks HD on my on my iPhone. I may be able to get away with a 800K or 1200K stream that looks really good, but is clearly not an HD resolution. But as soon as I hit that AirPlay button and sling it to the Apple TV, I have the expectation it's going to be HD. And so the blurring of the lines about experience and connectivity are only getting more convoluted. And I think the answer is that adaptive bitrate is the right approach, where you definitely need to have the ability to adapt the bitrate and further have the ability for a playback context to understand the capabilities of the device. But I don't think we're getting away from it. I think the consumer is actually being conditioned the opposite way because they watch the TV, and they see commercials for the Verizon, Torch 7 or whatever it is, and they see Jedis and ninjas flying out of the screen in HD, and they're like, okay, well that's what it's going to look like when I go down to my Verizon store and buy it. They have that expectation, and so we're going to have to deal with that, and we're going to have to put out the highest quality content we possibly can, and in order to compete for the eyeballs.
So Gerald, Michael, any thoughts about HD and as it relates to mobility and tablets?
Yeah, I mean, I can. Maybe it's being in the industry. You could tell the difference between an iPhone 3GS and iPhone 4 with Retina display. The quality and the difference is superior on the Apple device, and compared to a BlackBerry device. So the consumer, I think, as these screens get better and better, could be smaller, but I think they're going to be looking at the pixels and making sure it's the best quality that they can get. whether it be a tiny little screen on an iPod to an iPad or a 7-inch Android tablet. And then to Joe's point, you're going to be pushing that to whatever screen, that you have around you, and that's going to be the technology going forward.
So Michael, for you, in the broadcast space that you assist at Hurst, to Joe's point, what's the inside of Hurst, what's the thinking in terms of the watching experience on the 50-inch television versus on a 6-inch screen? Do you treat it the same? Do we think that the viewing experience is the same, or is it different?
No, from a user experience standpoint, you want to make sure you have a solution that can satisfy what the device, the baseline of what the device is going to be optimized for from a user experience. Now, I think where it gets complicated is if you're watching a streaming something, archive or live event on your iPhone, and then you walk into your house and you want to pause it there and then pick it up on your TV or on a greater resolution environment. You want to be able to have that seamless, and from an infrastructure standpoint, you want to be able to make sure you're doing a proper switch and have the technology to be able to do that. So, that's not doable today, but that's on the request list that we have for our solution provider to be able to do that, because we see that as a real use case. You can do it with things like Netflix. You can do it with a different environment than what we're seeing with our content, but we want to be ready when we're looking to do that with our content.
So
it's
let's
a little
talk
more sophisticated.
You've actually teed up a nice question too. So let's talk about consumption patterns. And this reminds me of something I heard a couple of weeks ago. Two individuals from major brand name service provider telco type organizations were talking about the first screen, right? Defining the first screen. So, and I thought it was interesting that they both said it was the living room. But if you look at the consumption patterns of the under 30 crowd today, I would argue that the first screen is probably the tablet. So how does that factor into your thinking in terms of how you think about your products and your workflow? Has that become something that you stop and think about, and you categorize these users differently based on their demographic data in terms of how they're going to consume the content?
I don't think it's a tablet. I think it's a mobile phone, for under 30 or under 25. So it's aiming at that and then making sure that you're optimized for the others.
Okay.
For us, it's time of day. So whatever that first screen is going to be, it's based on the time of day. For us, traffic usage is significantly higher during the day because everybody's in the office and they're online. Between that commute home, they're on their mobile device, and then at night they're on TV, and on the weekends, tablets. So it's where you are and where that person is in the cycle. Now, I'd say unemployment rate being at high rates, there's not a lot of people at work, so I think things will change a little bit, but, and I think that's why they're mostly on mobile. I think there's a lot of people that still at the end of this day still have to have that smartphone and consume that content wherever they are. So for us, it's more of where are you in your day, and that device and that content has to be there to serve you.
Joe, how's MLB defined first screen?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit easier for us in that my division of baseball is essentially a wholly owned subsidiary of the league, but we don't have any, first screen, if you call the first screen a TV set, rights. We're a pure digital organization that's 11 years old, and all we were born with was the digital rights. And so because I don't have any participation in the TV, I sort of ignore it to some degree. I mean, that's obviously a joke. You can't really ignore it, but at the same time, I'm really focused on monetizing off of the sort of primary display, if you will. I definitely think day part's a huge thing for us as well. I mean, you definitely see different consumption patterns depending on day part. You definitely see it sliced via age the way that you're talking about. I mean, for a kid in college right now, the smartphone is literally the possession that will be with them most of their entire life. They don't go anywhere. They don't. You hear stories about kids getting it wet in the shower in school. Because that's how close this device is. It's a very personal thing. It's like their key to the entire world. And so for that, and different demographics, they may prefer that even if they're sitting around a big screen. And most of them, a lot of them don't have one. Like, there is no second screen, that's it. I definitely think tablets and laptops, netbooks and things like that are also a very important thing. And so what we see is more, in the younger demographic, it's the transition between smartphone to tablet or smartphone to PC. And then maybe in that same demographic, it's the transition between smartphone, or same demographic but different age group, same transition between smartphone and then big screen, and then there's sort of the middle ground where it's the connected device big screen. So it's not provided by an MSO or an MVPD signal, it's actually provided by a Roku box or a PlayStation 3. And so there's definitely a lot of different things, but the conclusions that I think that you can draw is that most of the consumption is getting far more personal and far less communal. And so the communal part of it is certainly discussions and things like Twitter and social media. There's discussion about the concept, but it's much more solitary watching that's then factored into those. So even in a given living room, our CEO sometimes tells stories about where he has his iPad, kids have their iPad, they're all sitting in the living room, the TV's on, but really everybody's doing their own thing. And I think that that's a pretty typical American household in a lot of places. And so it will become increasingly more personal, which on some level actually lends to the ability to monetize better, because if you can get the right content in front of the person, that may have a better value proposition than sort of the shotgun approach of just broadcast television. But it also has the downside of that really affects the advertising models and the way that you do monetize it. And so ad-supported models, more so than subscription models, I think are actually more affected by that kind of demographic switch.
All right, so let's make the assumption that we have product managers or engineers in the audience from Adobe and Apple and Microsoft. I've seen a few of them here. Give them some feedback. What works? What doesn't work? What are some of your favorite features about their technologies? And what should they think about as this year's wrapping up and maybe they're putting together their product roadmap for next year? What are some of the things that they can learn from you, having this real-world feedback from in the trenches? Michael, let's start with you.
So I think Silverlight is a great framework, but isn't really relevant to us. So as a technologist, I think it's a great framework, not something we use. From Adobe standpoint, I'd like to see them more open. I'd like to see them embrace not only HTML5, which has been rumored, but open standards and get involved with the W3C org. I think they do really well on the workflow side, and we use them quite a bit for workflow. But I'd like to see them more involved and relevant for us on the publishing side.
How about HLS? Is that a big player at Hurst? No?
No, not for us.
Okay. Gerald?
I love HLS. HLS has simplified my life significantly. HTML5, still worry about that. What does that really mean? From my understanding, it's if we do any type of HTML5, our content will be, ripped apart, stolen, pushed out. Love Adobe. I wish Adobe could put more framework or support around an HLS DRM type of solution, and HLS has just changed my life significantly. That's probably one of the major changes that I've seen in this space.
So I want to hear from you, Joe, but just a quick follow-up there. So, and did I hear you clear to say that one of the biggest stumbling blocks today with HLS is the lack of DRM? Is that something that is needed?
For us, we have small pieces of content, clips, so we're not as concerned about, people taking our news clip, or News Now clip and, putting it out there, because, the lifespan of something like that is very limited. But as we move into more long form, which we don't do a lot of in the mobile space, but as we move towards that, I believe, I don't think that it's fully secure.
Okay. Joe, I've never known you to be opinionated about technology, so please, you can say I pass.
Yeah, totally love everybody. I would say that what most of the technologists out there for the various companies, Microsoft, Adobe, et cetera, that you manage need to learn from is not so much from us, but I think from salmon. Don't swim upstream. And so I'm with Gerald that HTML5, HLS specifically, has made an unbelievable improvement in the way that things work for us. And those 12 renditions I talk about are all HLS. And so we do some legacy Flash stuff, but it's really dwindling. And it is all encrypted, and so it does have DRM in it, and it's not in the browser, it is in an application, which is one of the limitations right now, which is unfortunate. It would be great if you could sandbox it in a browser effectively. But even Android, Google has come to the table now with HLS supported Honeycomb and Ice Cream Sandwich, and we applaud them for that. But if I was running Adobe, which I'm clearly not, notion is that why would I want to try to convince a content provider to make completely different content when I can focus on making really good tools, which is what they've always been known for, and then sell them great workflow and great tools to use the existing and leverage the existing content on platforms. The fact is right now, like, we're not going to look at authoring environment from anybody, be it Microsoft or Adobe, that's going to cause us to create a different rendition or a different authoring, transport, et cetera, because the economics of it are insane. It would be doubling our amount of effort, whereas with HLS on all the platforms I mentioned before, everything from PlayStation to Android devices to iPhones to the web, we use the same content, and that's what protects the subscription revenue that we have, and we have one of the most expensive and one of the best monetized subscription products out there. We have a couple of million paying subscribers at this point in time. Last year we were the top grossing app in the whole iTunes environment, not just in sports, but across iTunes. We beat Angry Birds, which is kind of cool.
Feat.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of birds and they're angry, they're ill-tempered, so it's tough to beat them. But so the key to that though is controlling the other side of it, is controlling the expense side of it. So I think that a lot of times technology providers out there look at it sort of simplistically and say, well, this is a great environment. I agree, Silverlight is an awesome framework. If Silverlight would play, HLS streams really, really well, and possibly even interoperate with the DRM side of it, I would seriously look at putting it out there. But if it doesn't, I'm not even going to take it a second glance, because the economics put the thing underwater before I could even evaluate whether or not the technology is super cool. And so we keep an eye on it because we have to, but the reality is that there's no economics behind it. And so if I'm a technology provider of technology tools, I need to understand what the whole environment from a content standpoint's economic model is, just as much as what the technological model is.
Okay, great feedback. So with that, we will turn it over to you for questions and answers. If anyone has any questions for the panel, happy to answer, or happy to ask and answer. Go ahead. Do we have a microphone? Anyone? MPEG Dash.
I love a lot of things that are in the standards committee, and I think that Dash's heart is absolutely in the right place. I think it's one of those things that trying to coalesce around a standard is cool. I think trying to coalesce around a standard in ISO makes a lot of sense. But the problem with Dash right now is it's just not real. It's a bunch of folks in a room that have agreed about the things that most people that believe in HTTP streaming would agree about. But when it comes to practical side of it, it's got a long way to go. And hopefully it'll get there. And I think that we support it getting there. But I also think that people that are involved with it need to be honest about the fact that it's not even close to ready for prime time. Live's not ready, DRM's not ready, network shim is not ready. The way that files, not to get too in the weeds, but some of the file management sides of it are not ready. The live encode side of it's not ready. And so right now, what we have is a couple of pretty good use cases for on-demand content that work for some providers, but it doesn't even come close to addressing the breadth of it. And I think that HLS is a great example of something that's gotten some pretty good traction. So, if there really is a grand unification of HTTP live streaming, all lowercase, where you wind up with an approach that interoperates with what Xeri may be and Silverlight and HLS, as it's currently in Apple's implementation, and that all gets unified under Dash, I think it would be great. If Dash becomes sort of one of those things that is a footnote that people check a compliance box, but in reality, there's Dash flavor A, with an Apple, and flavor B with, Microsoft, and C with Adobe, then it's not really getting anything done. So as I said, I support the standards effort. I think that they need to expand the scope, and I think that people need to, it's now time to get into the real practical use cases, especially live, because if you can't have live, no streaming protocol platform can possibly exist without live. Even though it may be a smaller percentage of the actual overall volume, live is the thing that sizzles, it's the thing that people want, it's the thing when they hear about news that's happening, they want to go. So if they want to go and see, an entertainment thing, somebody's going to get divorced, whatever, they're going to go, and they expect timeliness. And if they see Game 6 of the World Series and it's a slugfest and people are going back and forth, they expect to see that live. And I may have the best clips in the world, but if I can't address that live use case, then I'm irrelevant.
Any other opinions on Dash?
I'm more a fan of W3C's effort around web TV, so I'd side on more of the community-driven open standards approach to it.
Okay. Other questions? In the back?
So, continuing on with some of the technical discussions here, HLS is pretty fantastic, and you have the AES encryption that you can do on it, but that's still a far reach from digital rights management, proper digital rights management. Now, perhaps the choices you what you're comfortable with respect to the technology to use, but one of the challenges that I've found, and others I've talked to in the tablets and mobile space, is the differences in digital rights management platforms and being able to get those out to all the different consistently hit all the different platforms. Have you had that issue? Do you see that as well, and do you see any solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I hear you, and I think that there's a lot of truth in what you say. I also think there's a lot of truth in the fact that I personally think that DRM as a whole is a completely made up category. You know, ultimately what you have is content. That content has some amount of encryption on it with some format. And then you have control of the keys. And everything else is control of the client endpoints and the source. And so once those keys get out there, they get out there. And so if you have good control of the client, let's say something like Flash, which I think has pretty reasonable DRM, where the environment is trusted, and therefore you can tell the environment things like, let somebody play this for a week and then don't let them ever play it again, and you can control that endpoint and lock it down, then I think it works pretty well. The problem is all DRM in the streaming media space that's out there has been broken 2 days after they release it, because nobody has effectively locked down the end product. Nobody's locked down that playback environment. And so once you get those keys out there, then people can do whatever they want. So, Swift verification, for example, is very easy to defeat. You play it in a non-native Flash player, there's a bunch of VMs out there, go download it, and bang, done. It's completely defeated. And so I think that realistically what people, when they talk about DRM, want is, in my mind, what we're going to need to get to in order to get that done is more like what the ultraviolet folks are going towards. And I don't necessarily know that they got the right solution, but I think that their head's in the right place in that it's got to be an integration in the decode and kind of the rendering engine. And so if you can kind of put all that in hardware, it just makes it a lot harder to get at, as opposed to these sort of software virtual machines that run at a higher level that are very easy to spoof. And so for me, what we're left with is having to forcing us into dealing with the keys ourselves. And so, we have a bunch of security guys, and we do as much as we possibly can, focused on keeping the honest people honest. And, the black hats that are out there are going to go out, and they're going to hack these things, and it's going to get out, and your content's going to get out. I fortunately have content that is more valuable the closer it is to live. And so if I was a feature film person, I would probably have a much different opinion on it, because once the film's out, the film's out. And if it takes 3 weeks to crack it and it's a good film, it's going to live on for years, and that's a problem. And I don't quite exactly have that problem, but I think that, again, when people talk about DRM, especially like when we do some of our third-party business and we're dealing with studios, the problem is people don't really understand what's going on. And so you throw DRM and you're like, oh, it's got this DRM. And you're like, yeah, but that DRM it's all about implementation. If that DRM is not well implemented, then it doesn't actually provide you anything except a false sense of security. It doesn't actually provide any real security. And so I ultimately think that HLS is sort of right. I think this is something that Dash may get to. To be fair, Dash has not been around for very long, so I don't think it's yet something that they've really addressed, is that the whole picture of the rights management side of it has to be part of the overall protocol and the transit. Anything grafted on over the top is ultimately going to fail, just like every single one of them that's been out there has failed. And until we can get into hardware and get into more transport layer protocols like encryption, we're still going to be swimming upstream against the pirates.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, over here. 1 second. Wait for the microphone.
Ron.
Sorry, Jose. I had to make you run.
So there was some general agreement before that an improved quality of user experience leads to higher consumption. I was wondering if you could spend a minute talking about what tools or products you use to measure the quality of experience, and if there's any way that you quantify how that higher consumption leads to more benefit for your company.
For us, the quality test is looking on a device just with our visual. I don't think you can have QC tools that can test the multiple bandwidth. It's what we feel as a team, and our QA team looks at, 3G connection versus a Wi-Fi connection. And it's just our eye looking at it, making sure that things are clear, smooth. In terms of how that impacts us, revenue. We need to have our content at a high quality, but we also need those ads to play at a high quality. So all those things put together are very important. So it's not just our content, but it's also the ads playing right. It's additional technology to do possibly overlays over our video, and so that's an important factor. And the more videos somebody watches, the more income we're going to receive.
I mean, we do a lot of real-time performance monitoring. For us, when the events are live, if it doesn't go off well, it just doesn't go off. It's not like people are going to be like, oh yeah, no, I understand, I'll come back in the third inning, it'll be cool. And so for us, it's really important. So we use a lot of different partners, a lot of third-party analytics, a lot of our own homegrown analytics. We use a company called Conviva that does some pretty nice work with performance monitoring. And we've sort of integrated all that into a dashboard and a real-time system in our own way, because part of it is just, there's some level of things that you're not going to control. But we run very, very large events. I mean, we ran the back end for the World Cup with ESPN, the Algeria-US game that theoretically set the record for most concurrent live views. We also ran the back end for CBS March Madness, which theoretically set the record for the largest concurrent views. I'm not weighing in on either one of those being bigger than the other. They can fight that out in the media. But million plus sort of live concurrent folks. And there are times where there are things that you can affect and things that you can't. So one of the big things that we're always looking for is CDN performance. And so if I can move somebody from one CDN to another to improve their performance in real time, I'm going to do that. The other side of it also gets into rendition qualities. And so maybe it's one of those things that a million folks, I pop the top end stream to make a little bit more bandwidth so that one person isn't consuming twice, the bandwidth of two people at a slightly lesser rendition if I'm very concerned about a real-time experience. And so we've got some pretty sophisticated heuristics that deal with this, and some pretty sophisticated proactive measures that are driven by these heuristics to try to preserve the user experience in real time. All that being said, none of it's enough. We're constantly adding, constantly trying to put things into it. And what those do lead to is engagement, we hope. As I said, a lot of our stuff is subscription products, so it's a little harder to measure in that, it's not one more ad that somebody gets seen, although there are ads in our product, even our subscription product as well, because there's natural breaks in the game. But really the belief is that if people have a high quality experience, they believe that they're getting value for their money, they're going to come back time and time again. And we definitely see the better our heuristics and the better that the metrics that we collect show us that people are having a high quality experience, that it really does affect churn. And the churn is probably the best indicator of how good and how valuable your service is. Because acquisition can be affected by various different things. Churn is typically affected by people's experience. And so if you can mitigate churn, you're probably doing a pretty good job.
All right.
Good answer. I'll add my tools and then we'll end it. Is that cool?
Sorry?
I'm just going to say what we use.
Oh, sure.
Gomez, Akamai Media Analytics, and then because we're a customer of a SaaS provider, we benefit from the quality control aspect of being a part of a multi-tenant approach. So if we don't see a problem in our user experience, our other customers who are involved in the SaaS platform will, and so we take advantage of that if there's going to be a problem, somebody's going to see it, and then all of us will benefit from fixing that. But Gomez and Akamai do a pretty good job too.
Great.
I'm going to add one more. I've got 20 executives looking at a live stream, just go back to the live stream.
Test indicator.
And that is my testing. And we've got to make sure everything is buttoned up before it goes out. So we do a lot of testing beforehand to make sure those streams are good, but those 20 executives are looking at a live stream on different devices, different times, different connectivity speeds. So
they will find it.
They will find it before we do. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for the information, gentlemen. I think it's been a very useful session. I hope you agree, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.